All right, folks, buckle up, because we're about to take a deep dive into the book of Exodus. You know, the one with Moses, plagues, parting seas, the whole epic saga. I've got my own copy right here. And let me tell you, there's a lot more to uncover than just the highlights reel.
You're absolutely right. People think they know Exodus. I mean, who hasn't heard the story of Moses? But
Yeah.
there's so much more to it than just a basket and a burning bush. It's about leadership under pressure, societal anxieties, the lasting impact of choices made in extraordinary circumstances.
So it's not just ancient history. It's got some real relevance for today.
Absolutely. It's incredibly relevant. It's a timeless story.
I like where this is going. So when you're looking at Exodus, what jumps out at you as particularly interesting or unexpected?
You know, one of the things that always strikes me is how Exodus isn't just about Moses. It's easy to get caught up in his story, but it's about so much more than one man. It's about transitions of power, the dynamics of a whole society on the move, and the ripple effects of decisions made under immense stress.
That's a really interesting way to look at it.
Mm.
Okay, so let's dive into the text itself. Exodus chapter 1 starts off with a pretty stark contrast. On the one hand, the Israelites are multiplying, thriving even, but at the same time, there's this looming threat of oppression and death. How does that set the scene for everything that follows?
That juxtaposition, that tension right from the first chapter, it's key. And you see, as often in Hebrew writing, the very structure of the language often highlights contrasts. It's intentional.
So, like, the language itself is mirroring the themes of the story.
Exactly. In this case, it establishes that central tension that runs through the entire book, survival amidst oppression.
That's amazing. And speaking of tension, Pharaoh gets pretty freaked out by the growing Israelite population, right?
Oh, absolutely. He's worried they'll become more powerful than the Egyptians, and his solution is to deal wisely with them, which, let's be honest, basically means controlling them, suppressing their growth.
Classic power play. A
Yeah,
tale as old as time, right? Fear of the other leading to attempts at control. You could draw parallels to all sorts of situations throughout history and even today.
precisely. Exodus, as ancient as it is, taps into these universal anxieties about demographic shifts and the urge to maintain power in the face of perceived threats. It's human nature.
Okay, let's talk about baby Moses for a minute. I mean, talk about an iconic story. But I'm betting there are things about it most people don't realize.
Oh, definitely. There's a lot that gets overlooked or misinterpreted.
Like, for example, I always thought his mom was abandoning him when she put him in that basket and floated him down the river.
It seems that way on the surface, right?
Hmm?
But if you really consider the social context, leaving a baby by the river may not have been about abandonment at all. It could have been a calculated risk to ensure his survival within a specific social structure.
Wait, are you saying she wanted him to be found?
Think about it. Women were the ones most likely to be by the river, washing clothes, gathering water. Leaving a baby there significantly increased the chances of it being found and cared for, specifically by women. It was actually, in a way, a logical, even strategic decision.
Wow.
Yeah.
Talk about knowing your target audience. Okay, so baby Moses is found, grows up, and then, of course, there's the whole burning bush encountered. People usually interpret the burning bush symbolically.
Right. It's often seen as a symbol of Israel's suffering but not consumed. And that's a valid interpretation.
Makes sense.
But you know what? There's even more to it. If you look closely at the language in the text itself, the fire is described as being inside the bush, not an external force consuming it. It's an important distinction.
So it's less about destruction and more about a power that sustains from within.
Exactly. This isn't God's power conquering or overwhelming Israel. It's God's presence dwelling within them.
That's beautiful.
Right. It's a powerful image of God's sustaining grace, even in the midst of hardship.
And it's right in the middle of all this that God calls Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. But Moses is immediately hesitant, right? Isn't he kind of like, oh, God, wrong number. I can't even talk right.
Right. I'm the worst public speaker ever.
Exactly.
He's so relatable, isn't he? I mean, we've all felt inadequate when faced with a challenge that seems way too big. And that's what makes his story so powerful. He's flawed, he's afraid, and yet God chooses him anyway.
It's really encouraging, actually. So if we feel unequipped for something, it doesn't disqualify us from being used by God.
Not at all. Exodus teaches that God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. It's a powerful reminder that our perceived weaknesses can become strengths through him.
That's a good word. Okay, gotta ask about something that always kind of puzzled me, all those genealogies in Exodus. Like the one in chapter 6, I always kind of felt like those were speed bumps in the story. I mean, those lists of names, do they have any real significance beyond just lineage?
Oh, they're so important. Those genealogies aren't just about historical record keeping. They're about reaffirming identity and hope during a time of despair. Imagine being enslaved for generations, stripped of your history and heritage. Those lists of names were a powerful reminder. God remembers, God sees, God keeps his promises across generations.
Wow. I never thought of it that way.
It's powerful.
It's like each name represents a link in the chain of God's faithfulness.
Exactly. And that's a message that would have resonated so deeply with the Israelites who were, let's face it, living in a time of profound uncertainty and fear.
It's a God who sees them, who knows their names, even in the midst of their suffering. I love that. And then, of course, we get to the plagues.
The plagues. Now there's a moment everyone remembers.
Talk about a showstopper.
But these weren't just random acts of, divine destruction.
Right. It wasn't just God flexing, right?
Not at all. The plagues were targeted. They were calculated, designed to challenge the very foundations of Egyptian society and belief.
Okay. I like where you're going with this. So how so?
Well, think about it. Each plague was a direct challenge to the Egyptian gods and to the worldview they represented. Like, take the Nile turning to blood.
Okay, yeah.
The Nile, that was worshipped as a god, the source of life, of fertility.
Right.
So by turning it into blood, God was directly confronting the Egyptians with the impotence of their false gods.
It's like, oh, you think that's powerful? Watch this.
Exactly. And then you've got the plagues of frogs, gnats, flies, all creatures considered sacred in some way by the Egyptians.
So each plague was tailor-made to expose the emptiness of their beliefs?
Precisely. And it wasn't just about messing with their icons either. Don't forget about the hail devastating a land that practically never saw rain, or the darkness covering a land obsessed with the sun god Ra.
Right, right.
Each plague was a direct assault on the Egyptian understanding of the natural world, and the powers they believed controlled it.
It's like God was saying, let's put these so-called gods to the test, shall we?
Exactly.
And spoiler alert, the Egyptian gods did not fare too well.
Not even a little bit.
So then we get to the Red Sea crossing, which, talk about a visually stunning moment. Even just reading the description, it's cinematic.
Oh, absolutely.
But I've always wondered, what were the Egyptians thinking, chasing them into the sea? Like, that just seems like, strategically speaking, not a great move.
Right, you're telling me. But if you look at what the text actually says, Pharaoh and his army, they were convinced the Israelites were trapped. Wandering around confused, it says in Exodus 14.
Huh.
It was a classic case of underestimation, leading to a major strategic blunder.
It's like that old saying, never assume you know what the other side is thinking.
Exactly.
Or in this case, never underestimate the God on the other side.
Right.
Because that is a powerful God.
And the Red Sea crossing wasn't just about escape either. It was about a display of power, a demonstration of God's sovereignty over nature itself. Talk about a confidence booster for the Israelites.
Right? It's like, okay, so the God we're following just split the sea. I think we're going to be okay.
Right.
But then even after that, they still complained and doubted, didn't they? Like when they're in the wilderness and complaining about food.
You're talking about the manna, that bread-like substance God provided for them in the wilderness.
Yeah, they were pretty quick to forget that whole Red Sea miracle, weren't they?
Weren't they? It's actually kind of reassuring in a weird way, isn't it?
Oh, so?
Well, even after witnessing something as mind-blowing as the Red Sea parting, they still struggled with doubt and fear, just like we do.
It's true. It's very human.
It shows that human nature is pretty consistent, regardless of time period or miraculous experiences. We all have those moments where we forget what God has done for us and start to, grumble about our circumstances.
Okay. Yeah, we do. And what's fascinating is that even when they grumbled, God still provided for them. He gave them the manna, those detailed instructions about gathering only what they needed each day.
There's a lot to unpack there.
There really is.
It wasn't just about, providing sustenance. It was a daily lesson in trust, in obedience, in the importance of relying on God's provision.
It's like God was saying, look, I'm not going to give you a year's worth of groceries all at once. You need to learn to trust me day by day.
Exactly. And honestly, that's a lesson that resonates just as strongly today, don't you think?
Oh, 100%.
I mean, in a world obsessed with security and control, it's a pretty radical act of faith to wake up each morning and say, okay, God, I'm trusting you to provide for my needs today.
It is. It really is. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the law. Everyone knows the 10 Commandments, of course, but Exodus goes way beyond those 10 big ones, right?
Oh, absolutely. Chapters 21 through 23, they dive into all sorts of specific legal cases, giving us this really fascinating glimpse into what it looked like to apply those broader principles of the Ten Commandments to daily life.
And there are some real eye-openers in there.
Totally.
Like we were talking about before, that law about selling your daughter into servitude. That's a great example.
Yeah, that one definitely raises some eyebrows for a modern audience.
It sure does, to say the least. So how do we even begin to understand that?
Well, context is key, as always. We have to remember that we're talking about an ancient Near Eastern culture, and it was a patriarchal society. Resources were often scarce, and frankly, women's options were limited.
So in that context, what was the purpose of that law? It sounds pretty harsh when you first read it.
It does, it really does. But it wasn't about what we might think of as slavery today. It was more like a family, and often this was a poor family, essentially entrusting their daughter to another household, maybe a wealthier one, where she would work.
So almost like a type of arranged marriage, but with an emphasis on labor, not necessarily romance.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. And it's important to remember that even within this system, there were provisions to prevent abuse. Like, there were laws about fair treatment, limits on the length of service. A daughter could even be redeemed, bought back by her family if their circumstances improved.
So while it's definitely a different cultural context, when you understand those social structures, it makes a bit more sense.
Right. It's about understanding the nuances of the time.
Okay, there's another part in Exodus that kind of makes me scratch my head a bit. It's that golden calf incident.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they've just seen God split the Red Sea. You'd think they'd be all in, and then they turn around and build an idol. What was going on there?
Honestly, I think it's a perfect example of how human nature really doesn't change all that much.
How so?
Even after experiencing God's power and faithfulness in such a tangible, undeniable way, they still revert to what's familiar, to what they can see, what they can control.
It's like they couldn't quite grasp the God who had just rescued them, so they opted for a God they could manage, one who fit within their limited understanding.
Exactly. And you see this impulse throughout history, this need to contain the divine,
Yeah.
bring something transcendent down to a level we can grasp.
It's interesting then how that contrasts with the image of Moses coming down from Mount Sinai, with his face shining so brightly that the people are afraid.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It's like they crave God's presence, but they're also terrified of it, of its power, its otherness.
It's that tension that you see all the time in our relationship with God, right? That push and pull between desire and fear, reverence and familiarity.
Absolutely. It's so human. And, this whole conversation, the tabernacle, that golden calf, even Moses' shining face, it all ties back to something you said earlier about the importance of creating space for God's presence.
It's really at the heart of Exodus, isn't it?
It really is.
I mean, the tabernacle with all its intricate details and symbolism, that was all about creating a physical space where God's presence could dwell among the people.
But it wasn't just about a physical building, right? It was also about cultivating that inner space where God's presence could reside.
Precisely. That's what it's all about, building a life that's open to encountering God, making space for the sacred in the everyday, the ordinary.
So less about external rituals and more about cultivating an inner posture of, receptivity,
Yes,
surrender.
exactly. And that's a challenge that goes way beyond ancient Israel. It's something we still wrestle with today, right?
Absolutely. Which is why a book like Exodus, even though it was written thousands of years ago, still feels so incredibly relevant.
It's timeless, these stories.
It's true. And I think that's why we love diving into scripture like this. It's a source of endless wisdom and insight.
Every time you come back to it, you find new layers of meaning. It's incredible.
So to our listeners out there, we encourage you. Open up Exodus for yourselves. Wrestle with the parts that challenge you, embrace the beauty, and let it all lead you a little deeper in your understanding of God and your place in the story. Because honestly, we've just scratched the surface today.
We really have. There's so much more to discover there.
That's the fun part. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking the one who's always seeking you.